Grammar Lesson 5.4, the present progressive tense. Throughout today's lesson, I'm going to be using a couple of phrases that I want you to be familiar with. The first is gerund, and the second is present participle. First, let's talk about what these phrases mean. A gerund is technically considered a noun, but it comes from a verb. In English, these are the words that you often use that end in the letters ing. In Spanish, they're going to end in either ando or yendo. So some English examples to make sure you understand what I'm talking about would be like the word dancing. If I said, the dancing was beautiful. Or I could say, reading makes me tired. Or I might say, my mom's cooking is incredible. So in these examples, the words dancing, reading, and cooking were used as nouns, even though the word actually comes from a verb. So that's what a gerund is. Next, let's talk about present participles. Present participles look exactly like gerunds. The only thing that's really different is how they're used. Present participles are used with the word to be to indicate that some type of an action is in progress or happening. Oh, we seem to have a question.
Can present participles also be used as adjectives?
Oh, great question. In English, present participles can be used as adjectives. Think of the examples like loving or caring. I could say, my grandparents are so loving, and in that case, the word loving is an adjective. Or I might say, the winning team is the best, and in this case, the word winning is used as an adjective. Keep in mind, though, that in Spanish, it doesn't exactly work that way. Adjectives look a little different. For example, if I wanted to say my grandparents are very loving, I wouldn't say amando, I would say mis abuelos son muy amorosos. And the winning team wouldn't be el equipo ganando, it would be el equipo ganador. So keep in mind, even though present participles are often used as adjectives in English, it's not necessarily the case in Spanish. Let's talk about how to form a gerund or a present participle from a verb. Right now you can see three regular pattern verbs. We have hablar, which is an AR verb, comer, an ER verb, and escribir, an IR verb. Now if you think back to when we were conjugating verbs, the first thing we had to do was take off the ending, the AR, ER, or IR ending. We're going to do the same thing when we form gerunds and present participles. This time, instead of having 6 different endings that you have to memorize, there's really only 2. So this is going to be a lot easier. For AR verbs, when you take the AR off, you're going to replace it with ANDO or ando. For ER and IR verbs, you take the ER or IR ending off and replace it with yendo, spelled I-E-N-D-O. We seem to have another question. Go ahead, sir.
What about those verbs that already have back-to-back vowels? Would they then have 3 vowels in a row?
Oh, excellent question. You must be referring to these verbs. Caer, creer, leer, oír, and traer. Now, these verbs are a little bit different. Instead of taking the ER or IR ending off and replacing it with yendo, this time we're going to replace it with yendo, but it's spelled a little bit differently. Instead of an I, we use a Y. So the gerunds or present participles for these verbs would be cayendo, creyendo, leyendo, oyendo, and trayendo. Next, let's talk about how you form gerunds and present participles from stem-changing verbs. If you're dealing with an AR verb or an ER verb, they don't stem change in the gerund or present participle. So there's not really anything you have to do with these verbs that's different than any other AR or ER verb. Now, IR verbs are a little bit different. Here's the rules for IR stem-changing verbs in the gerund or present participle form. Verbs that are typically E to IE verbs in the present tense will simply have an E to I stem change in the present participle, as in the example, prefiriendo. Verbs that are E to I stem change the same way that you're used to. You will still change the E to an I, as in the example consiguiendo. Verbs that you are used to conjugating with the pattern O to UE in the present tense will now simply change O to U in the present participle or gerund form, as in the example dormir would change to durmiendo, not duermiendo with a UE, just a U. As with all other types of verb forms, there are a couple of irregular forms in the present participle. But the good news is there's only 2 of them, so there's not too much to remember here. One of the irregular forms is the verb ir. Since you can't really just take the IR off and replace it with yendo, this one follows that same rule as those other verbs that had back-to-back vowels, and we would use the Y instead. So to say the word going, you would say yendo. The other irregular verb is poder. It doesn't look that strange because you're used to poder being an O to UE stem changing verb. So it would make sense that you would just change the O to U. The reason this one is considered irregular, however, is because it's an ER verb, and that stem changing rule that we had just talked about only applies to IR verbs typically. Poder is the one exception. Let's talk a little bit more about how we use these present participles now that you know how to form them. They are used in something that's called the present progressive tense. In the present progressive tense, we're basically going to be using the present participles that we just talked about with the verb for to be, which you know as estar. Now remember when we first talked about the verbs ser and estar, and I taught you the doctor place acronym? We had skipped over the A in estar, which stood for action. Today, that's what we're going to be focusing on. As a quick reminder, here are the 6 conjugations of the verb estar. We have yo estoy, tú estás, él, ella, or usted está, nosotros estamos, vosotros estáis, and ellos, ellas, ustedes están. Here are a couple of examples of how we use the verb estar with the present participles to form sentences. ¿Qué estás haciendo? What are you making or what are you doing? Yo estoy bailando. I am dancing. ¿Qué está haciendo tu hermana? What is your sister doing? Ella está cocinando. She is cooking. Oh, we have another question. Go ahead, sir.
So, are there any other verbs besides estar that can be used with present participles?
Oh, great question. There are a few other verbs, although estar is the most common. One other verb that we'll be using a little bit in this class to practice the present participles is the verb seguir. Hopefully you remember the verb seguir from when we did our stem changing verb list, but it means to keep or to follow. So if I said the sentence, ella sigue dibujando, that means she keeps drawing. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between the present tense versus the present progressive tense. They're very similar and can be used somewhat interchangeably. When you first learned about the present tense, you learned that each conjugation can mean 3 things. So for example, yo estudio could mean I study, I do study, or I am studying. And then if you wanted to turn that into a question, you could say yo estudio, or flip-flop your subject and verb, estudio yo, which would then mean do I study, am I studying, and we didn't have to put a different word in there for do or am. The present progressive tense is, like I said, somewhat interchangeable with the regular present tense. The only difference is that it's mainly used to emphasize when an action is in progress at the time of speaking. So if I want to say like I'm doing something right now, then I might want to use the present progressive tense. Here's an example. Yo estoy estudiando. I am studying. And to add just a little more emphasis, I might include the phrase ahora mismo, which means I am studying right now. Another common phrase that's used with the present progressive tense is the word todavía, which means still or yet. For example, yo estoy estudiando todavía. I am studying still. As you know, in English, you can kind of rearrange the word still and put it in different places in your sentence. You could say, I am still studying, still I am studying, I'm studying still. There's a couple of different options, and it's kind of the same way in Spanish. So you may choose to move the word todavía to the beginning or front of your sentence, and that would be acceptable in Spanish just as it is in English. There's one more grammar rule I want to go over with you really quickly, and that is that object pronouns, when they're used with a gerund or present participle, can go before the conjugated verb, like you're used to, or they can also be tacked onto the end of the gerund or present participle. For example, if I want to say I am eating it, and it is referring to the food or the meal, la comida, we know that comida is feminine, so we're going to use the direct object pronoun la. So I could say, yo la estoy comiendo, or I could say, yo estoy comiéndola. Oh, our friend is back with one more question, it looks like. Go ahead, sir.
I'm confused. Why is there an accent on the letter E in the second example?
Oh, that's a great question. When an object pronoun is attached to the present participle or gerund, an accent mark is added just to help you maintain the proper stress and make sure you're pronouncing the word correctly. You would want to make sure you're saying yo estoy comiéndola and not something that would sound kind of strange like yo estoy comiéndola and putting the emphasis on the wrong letter. So basically, it's just there to help you out with pronunciation. That concludes today's lesson. I hope that you have at least a basic understanding of the present progressive tense and how gerunds and present participles are formed and used in sentences. Let me know if you have any questions.